budget, and today we have 3 items that we'd like to talk about. The governor's budget proposals on student attendance adjustments, cost of living adjustments, and payment deferrals, as presented by the Department of Finance, and then the LAO will comment, and we will have the Department of Education if they have other things to add to the conversation. We'll start with Department of Finance. Welcome, and I think we're going to go talk about the overall Proposition 98 funding, and we're going to add the redevelopment agency's proposal as it relates only to Proposition 98. And the same thing goes to the realignment proposals, and only as it relates to the K-12 programs. Okay? Should we get started? Okay. Mr. Bell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. My name is Jeff Bell. I'm from the... Sorry.
All right, thank you. I just assumed that we saw 3 people up here. You knew who we were. Okay. All right, let's call the roll.
Senator Liu.
Here.
Senator Huff.
Here.
Senator Wright.
Here.
Again, good afternoon, Madam Chair and
Sorry.
members. My name is Jeff Bell. I'm an assistant program budget manager from the State Department of Finance, and I'm here to present to you the overview of the education portion of the governor's budget for 2011-12. And in the components that you outlined a few moments ago, if I might, be able to present to you issues 1 through 3 in a comprehensive section, if that's okay with you.
That's fine.
We could cover those together, if that's okay with all the members as well. Thank you very much. We do have a handout as well. Perhaps we could provide that to you.
Sure.
and the members.
I think the sergeants will help us with that, too.
And it's just one handout there that
Okay.
we provide at this time. That'll show the relationships in the Proposition 98 portion. With me this afternoon at the table is Lisa Nguyen, and she also is a principal at the Department of Finance, and she handles the Proposition 98 and charter schools and a number of the other areas in education finance. And we also have a number of other principals and staff in the audience. So as we get into other areas of education finance, we have other areas we need to discuss. There's other staff here as well. As you already know, and I'm sure you saw in the governor's presentation on January 10th and then in subsequent discussions, the intent of the governor's budget proposal for education in 2011-12 is to maintain the Proposition 98 guarantee close to the level that was provided in 2010-11. And in the handout that was provided to you that you can see for 2010-11, you can see that the guarantee is at $49.7 billion, and that is in the shaded section there. And then as you move to the right in 2011-12, you can see it's at $49.3 billion. And that being the intent that we keep the guarantee at the amount that was suspended at in the current year. But what you also see there is a dotted line above that, and that's where we move to the second portion of the conversation, and that is where we intend in the budget proposed by the governor to keep programmatic expenditures. And built into the governor's proposal for the guarantee is that we be able to spend programmatically at the same level or that we are spending in the current year. And so what you see as we move from left to right is that by deferring in the budget year as well in the current year, we are able to maintain both the same level of expenditures in 2010-11 in 2011-12 as in 10-11. And as you know, in 2010-11, there is a $1.7 billion deferral that will come due in the 11-12 fiscal year. As part of the governor's budget proposal, there is a $2.2 billion deferral that is proposed that would come due in the subsequent fiscal year, which would be 12-13. So there's a $1.7 billion deferral from 10-11 to 11-12 already. The budget proposes for 11-12 a $2.2 billion deferral that would go to 12-13. And that's what you see here in the deferred expenditures, which is the dotted line from 2010-11 to 2011-12. If I could turn for a few moments now to growth and COLA. The COLA factor that was calculated was a 1.67% COLA, which came to approximately $964.5 million. Given the fiscal circumstances of the state, we were not able to provide that level of expenditures for education funding. And as a result, it increased the deficit factor that has been calculated for expenditures in education to about 19.6%, of which about $656 million is in revenue limits. Additionally, on the growth side, growth would be at about 2.2% for education in 2011-12. The budget includes growth for just a few key areas that provide core instructional programs, and that's in the following areas: special education, charter schools, and revenue limits. And that's simply the key areas that we are able to provide growth for in the coming fiscal year. So by way of summary, the governor's budget provides for a Proposition 98 guarantee that is close to what we have in the current year, with a deferral that allows the same level of programmatic expenditures that you see in 2010-11 in 11-12, but was not able to provide COLA factor, and as such it does increase the deficit factor slightly to 19.6% and provides growth in core instructional programs. I'd now be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay. Mr. Huff?
Thank you.
Mr. Wright? Senator Wright?
And I'm not sure that we're reading. I'm reading on, I guess this is page 3 of this. Do you have this document?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. I just learned it's always good when everybody's reading from the same page in the hymnal.
Okay.
In the categorical programs, where you see is a $16.1 million increase for charter schools, why them and not the other schools?
Charter schools is one of the core instructional programs that we were describing earlier, Senator, that we felt that was one of the key areas, given the limited opportunity that we had to provide growth funding. That was one of the key areas that we saw we would be able to, given the limited resources that we had to provide growth, that was one of the key core instructional programs that we felt it would be important to provide growth for. And given the number of charter school growth that we've seen over the past few years, this was one of the areas that was provided growth in.
Maybe I didn't ask it well. The money for the charter school essentially comes out of the same pot that's regular school funding. So if there's a charter school in L.A., the amount of money that goes to the charter school is deducted from L.A., right? If a child enrolls in a charter school, the money that followed that child goes to the charter school, and it no longer goes to L.A. So L.A. gets less money when a child goes to a charter school.
Elisa Wynn with Department of Finance. You're right in terms of revenue limits, that the revenue limit follows the child. So if the child goes to a charter school, they will get a revenue limit for that charter school. What we provided was charter categorical growth, and basically because we have ADA counts that show that students are increasing in those charters and they do get a charter categorical block grant, we provided funding based on that ADA increase. So does that help to answer your question?
No.
So Jennifer Kuhn from the Ledge Analyst. Again, this is their proposal, so I'm just going to try to help on the technical side as to what's being done. So apart from this proposal deals only with categorical funding. And the way the state has addressed categorical funding for LA and regular districts is to just lock in their allocation. So over the last few years, LA and every other district has been getting what they got, largely in 7-8 or 8-9. Now, charters don't get a natural piece of that. Districts can have certain arrangements, but by and large, the state has a different mechanism for getting categorical funding to charters. Charters are growing much more rapidly than the statewide average. They're in excess of 10% a year. So as I understand the proposal, it's a way to actually give some categorical funding, which wouldn't on the natural come from nowhere else. Now, they've spent $16 million on it. It is one of their priorities. They could have spent the $16 million elsewhere. So sure, that is within your purview to make that particular.
So I've got a school district in my area where the charter schools are ultimately going to bankrupt them, because as those children leave, that school disproportionately has high-cost kids that don't go to the charter. So in time, I'm just saying, I mean, it would seem to me that if I got $16 million to spend, that it ought to just go to the school. If you're saying that there's growth in the charter, then that ought to be a function of ADA and allocated equally. It shouldn't be that I single out one category of school to get extra money. They already get. I mean, if you're arguing that the charter school currently gets less money per ADA, then
it would not get the categorical money. There's no money in the categorical funding for the charter school absent this increased amount for the growth for charter schools. So as the charter schools grow, an additional allocation of funding for charter school categorical block grant is provided to address the growth for the charter schools. So as charter schools grow, the categorical block grant doesn't have the amount of funding within the program funding to address that growth. So this was funding that was put into the program to address that growth.
Let me try this one more time. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Senator.
And I apologize if I'm inartfully asking.
The program question.
So when a child goes to a charter school today, so he's in the Inglewood Unified School District and he leaves to go to Green Dot, which is a real scenario, by the way. Okay, when he leaves to go to Green Dot, the Inglewood Unified School District sends a sum of money with that child. That Inglewood no longer receives a allocation of dollars for that child. That dollar goes to Green Dot from Inglewood. So Inglewood is deducted, and Green Dot is increased based on that child moving.
Yeah.
That's the revenue
right, per revenue limits, right.
This is categorical monies.
This is for the categorical programs that charter school would. In this specific instance, the funding that we're describing in the proposal is for the additional categorical programs that the charter school, that student, excuse me, would subsequently participate in, would be now participating in at Green Dot in the scenario that you
the argument that you would make, and the argument that you would make is that then Green Dot currently receives an insufficient amount of categorical funding
to provide for that student who's just arrived to participate in that categorical program, and so this is growth funding for that program.
And if that child had stayed at Inglewood, you're saying that the categorical funding would have been sufficient. I mean, somebody's going to be left holding the bag, and I'm just saying it appears to me that you've decided that, $16 million in the scheme of things isn't a great deal of money in any event. But I'm just saying, at some point in the shell game, somebody ain't going to get no cookies. So you've made a decision that it's the...
What we were attempting to address in the governor's proposal is the growth that has been identified in the program that has been seen over the past several years in the charter school categorical block grant, because it has been growing with the charter program, and this is the amount that is anticipated as needed for that program, because we've seen the growth
to cover the growth. So
yes.
you fund the categorical separately from the revenue limit side, and so this is an increase to cover
those categorical
a growth that you say was not sufficient to cover the growth in those schools.
Right.
Fine.
In this program.
Okay.
Senator Huff.
Yeah, for the LAO, it's kind of a parallel question, and I may not be very good at phrasing that either, but sort of building on the illustration that Senator Wright had, if you have a student in one district and they choose to go to a charter, is it a one per $1 that follows that child, or is there some left at the district of residence or the school of residence?
I think what's complicating matters is, well, I think everybody's on the same page. Revenue limits are very straightforward. So the dollar is shifting with the child as intended. It was purposely structured to shift with the child. Since the state put the 40 categorical programs together and said you can use them for any purpose, the world's become a little bit more complicated. And then even with the programs outside that are not flexible but are still standalone, some have received actually, I don't think any have received growth over the last little while, except for child nutrition. So then it's becoming a little bit more complicated because a district is getting essentially an old allocation, and whether it's increased in ADA or decreased in ADA, the state no longer is sensitive to those adjustments. So when it comes to the categorical world right now, apart from charters, we've sort of lost the connection with students. It's one of the reasons that we've been arguing the last few years with the flex item, the 40 programs that are flexible, reconnect them to students so that this conversation could be more meaningful, because in every district, the dollar would be shifting with the child, whether it was a revenue limit dollar or a categorical dollar. It's just the last few years it's become much murkier as to what's shifting because the formulas are no longer tied to the kids.
And so this is an attempt to help make it more equitable.
This on the charter end is attempted to keep the link. And we would argue, yes, keep that link and reestablish the link on the district side. On the charter side, there's an additional complication because they get this in lieu stream for categoricals. Even before the state had the 40 categoricals that it made flexible, it already had a flexible categorical block grant for charters. And that was never really tightly connected to the underlying programs, so charters on paper weren't quite getting what their district partners were getting. And I think a little bit of this is to try to make up for that disparity as well. So multiple factors moving around.
Okay.
I have another separate question when we're through with that.
Okay. Senator Wright?
Okay, no,
okay.
Go ahead. I'm just.
All right.
I mean, I'm watching, again, in many instances where I've got districts that are incurring costs, and it's not being distributed. I mean, to your point, I mean, it doesn't appear that the dollar follows the child, nor does the dollar follow the child who might have special issues that go with him. So my school districts that are having charter issues have a disproportionately high number of high needs kids and special ed kids and other kinds of things that the dollar doesn't follow. And so some of that concerns me as well. I mean, when that's created. But I mean, if the argument is that there was a block of money that was not allocated properly and that the charter school was in effect shortchanged, then I mean, there's not an argument. I mean, I just have to trust your math that there was a shortchanging that occurred, and that it's not an attempt to, in effect, shift dollars from the public school to the charter school because they become a sacred cow of some kind.
Okay. You have a response, Mr. Bell?
It's not an attempt at shortchanging. It's an attempt to ensure we address the growth associated with the charter schools to make sure that there's an appropriate amount of resources for those students as they arrive at the charter schools.
But it is so small. I mean, in essence, it's total between that and special ed's about $23.5 million. It's not a huge allocation, as you said in the beginning. And Mr. Huff, you have another question?
Yeah, it's a separate question, and I think Senator Wright just said something I want to clarify. He said shifting from a regular school to a public school to a charter school. The charters are public schools. I mean, it's a different construct, but not to blur that distinction. My real question is for Department of Finance. This budget is obviously constructed with a hole that is intended to be filled by the taxpayers at the ballot box, $10, $11 billion or so of taxes. So what happens to the Prop 98 minimum guarantee if that plan does not work out?
Well, the initial amount is $2 billion. That's what we've assumed with the amounts that have been built into the proposal. So there's $2 billion built in.
Because as I recall, we're actually solving, because of Prop 98, we have to raise $4 billion roughly to give the $2 billion that you're putting up. So we keep calling it a $26.4 billion problem that has a $1 billion surplus into it, but it's really a $28.4 billion problem with a little $2 billion in brackets. It's going back, and it gets a little bit complicated.
Right.
But bottom line is it'd be $2 billion less under Prop 98 minimum guarantee if the taxes are not extended, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Is there just to build on this, does the governor have a backup plan, Plan B, if the proposals in the June election does not come forward?
We will have to address that as it comes, Madam Chair.
Okay. Okay. LAO?
So Jennifer Kuhn with the Ledge Analyst Office, and you should have a handout that says Overview of the Prop 98 budget. It's intended to be a very high-level overview. Again, as with finance, we'll cover all three issues on the agenda. It's mostly intended to lay out the overarching big picture Proposition 98 issues, knowing that in the coming weeks she'll deal in much more detail with the specific issues. Mm-hmm. And then it's trying to help identify the really big Proposition 98 issues and give you some context and a little data as you go about answering those big picture questions. So the first page again, and I'll go over very quickly because I know finance did a good job laying out the basics, but it'll show that if you look behind the double line here, under the governor's proposal, Proposition 98 funding goes down by $358 million. It's a reduction of 0.7%. And then if you look by area, you can see that for K-12 education, under the governor's proposal, essentially flat year over year. Community colleges are going down the $361 million, a little bit more than 6%. So finance did a good job, again, going over growth and COLA, so I'll just go ahead and skip that for now. So page 2 actually lists all of the year-to-year changes in the governor's plan. And so I know there's a long list there, but I just wanted to mention briefly the ones in bold. So there are three main components of the governor's package. The first is the deferral that you've heard a little bit about. And because it's the only major K-12 proposal, we have several pages in the handout that will go over that in much more detail. The one major child care has several proposals, but the largest one is a rate reduction of 35%, and it would yield $577 million. So again, that will be a major component of your child care conversation in the coming weeks. The governor also has a $400 million reduction to community college apportionments. This is offset a little bit by the fee increase revenue. It's a net reduction of $290 million. And then the community colleges also have a deferral, obviously much smaller in size, only $129 million. But in terms of share, it's about the same share as the K-12 deferral. So those are the three big pieces. On page 3, it lays out, okay, over the next 40-some days or a month and a half, what are the big issues that the legislature needs to resolve? And as was already touched upon, one of the biggest ones is, what are you going to assume about the tax package? Are you going to have a contingency plan? What happens after you know the results? Will everything hold, or will you need a few more options? The other big question before you is whether you want to allocate whatever reductions are necessary in the same way as the governor. Do you want to cut K-12 education, community colleges, and child care to the same magnitude as he does, or do you want to distribute them slightly differently? And then the other major question is, do you want to go into the year relying on deferrals? And if so, how heavily do you want to rely on deferrals? And that's largely why we spend so much time in the handout walking through the deferral item, because it's such an important part of the governor's package. So the next few pages just go through, and they start with the first issue, and they try to provide a little context for grappling with them. So we've already talked a little bit about the tax package, but this, just for your reference, provides some detail regarding the general fund tax package items and their impact on Prop 98. So as you can see across the 2 years, when you're looking just at the general fund revenue proposals, it's an increase of $8.1 billion. And it shows you how that's split across the 2 years, with $3.2 billion scored to the current year and $4.9 billion scored to 11-12. Because Proposition 98 is suspended in 10-11, there is no impact of raising that $3.2 billion in 10-11. But in 11-12, if you wanted to meet the guarantee, as you were talking about before, raising the $4.9 billion in revenue would increase the guarantee by $2 billion. That, again, essentially offsets other solution. It means you need $2 billion more in other solution if you want to solve the entire $25 billion problem. Completely apart from this, what you'll talk about a little bit later today, just briefly, is the realignment issue, and there's also revenue associated with that, almost $6 billion, but that's completely disassociated under the governor's plan from these general fund proposals that do impact Prop 98. As with all of the final comment on this page, as you will experience with all of the tax proposals, the expiring in 5 years is an important consideration. In some years, the Prop 98 formulas are very sensitive to revenues. And were you in one of these environments when the taxes expired, you could see a big drop overnight in the Proposition 98 guarantee. The $5 billion or something like it on an annual basis would go away, and the guarantee could go down to $2.5 billion. On the flip side, there are some years where the Prop 98 formulas are not sensitive to the general fund. And if you happen to be in one of those years, the guarantee would essentially stay right where it is, inflated from the state's point of view, because it will lose the 5 or 6 some billion. The guarantee won't go down. And now building the rest of your budget will be just that much more difficult. It'll start crowding out spending on the rest of your budget. So a very important factor just to keep in mind, how does the state want to address 5 years from now the impact on both education and the rest of the budget? The next 3 pages try to help provide some context for the second big question. To what degree do you want to cut K-12 relative to the community colleges and childcare? So this page focuses just on K-12. And as you know, it used to be a much simpler conversation. We would look at Proposition 98 per pupil, and we'd give you the numbers over time, and it was pretty easy to interpret what they meant. But over the last few years, what we used to think about as Prop 98 supported program, the state has been supporting with lots of other funding sources. So what this table tries to do is to give you a meaningful apples-for-apples comparison between what does that program look like today when you compare it to 7-8. And as you can see in 10-11, that school district program was down about 5% from the year before the recession began. And under the governor's proposal, it would go down a bit more to 6.4%. So then to give you comparison what this looked like from the community college and child care perspective, page 6 does the same thing for community colleges. And the last column here will show you that for the community colleges, they're down 3.9% in 10-11 from the 7-8 level. So again, by comparison, K-12 was down 5%. Community colleges is much more difficult in 11-12, largely, and you'll have a long conversation, I'm sure, about this, but their per pupil amounts are very sensitive to what you assume about enrollment. The governor has assumed community colleges will serve almost 2% more students in 11-12. But the chancellor's office has said if you cut us $290 million, it's unlikely we're going to serve more students. We're proposing we serve about 60,000 students less than last year. And obviously now this is a big band in terms of the number of students that might be served at the community colleges. The more you serve, the smaller the dollar rate because you have the same pot of money to work with. So under the governor's plan, 10% reduction from 7-8. Under the chancellor's plan, a 3 or 4% reduction. So we're just giving you this range because it's hard to know exactly where you'll land. That will depend upon your enrollment assumption. But by comparison, K-12 is down about 6.5%.
Okay.
The last one is on the child care. And as you look at the first 3 years here, from 7-8 through 9-10, child care was largely insulated from reductions. And then in 10-11, they were hit much more substantially than either K-12 or community colleges. And then under the governor's plan, down significantly more, the 37% reduction. So again, just trying to give you some context for deciding how you want to allocate the cuts across the areas. So the next several pages are all related to issue 3 on your agenda regarding deferrals, and Edgar Cabral is here to walk you through.
So Edgar Cabral with the LAO, and I just want to walk through give you some background on how the state has used deferrals over the past few years, and give you something to think about in terms of trade-offs for whether you want to adopt this new deferral. There are two kinds of deferrals that the state has done. There's an intra-year deferral where the state takes money from within a fiscal year and moves it and pays it later in the year. Usually this is done for cash reasons. So for example, July tends to be a cash poor month now, so the state pushes some of those payments and pays them in September, for example. That's a cash situation. This that we're going to talk about here more are intra-year deferrals, or what we call cross-year deferrals sometimes, and that's a deferral that the state chooses to defer payments from this year to next year, and that's usually done for budget purposes. The state can't afford the program that it would like to provide, and so it pays the funding late so that districts can continue to operate the program even though the state can't provide the money in that year. On page 8, you have a list of all of the deferrals that the state has adopted over the past few years, plus the governor's proposal. And if you look at the bottom under the shaded rows, you'll see first that under the governor's proposal, the state would be deferring $10.4 billion in K-12 and community college payments. If you look at that as a share of the Proposition 98 program, of the funding that school districts and community colleges are receiving for the purpose of operating the 11-12 program, about 21% would be paid late.
Wow.
On the next page, on page 9, we show you a little bit of the history of the deferrals and how they've increased in costs over time. So you can see the first deferral that the state enacted was in 2001-2, and there was a little bit of a bump that came back down. The state actually paid off a little bit of a deferral, and it was pretty constant until 2008-9. When the state during the big mid-year crises after the recession deferred about $3.2 billion in Proposition 98 payments. This was in this deferral, the first 2008-9 deferral, and the others before then were all mid-year deferrals. So the state adopted a budget, and then in the middle of the year there was a big budget deficit, and the state decided rather than go in and cut schools mid-year, which can be a problem for schools because schools don't often have the flexibility to, for example, lay off teachers and things like that. There are some state restrictions that prevent them from doing so. The state decided to defer payments and pay them late instead. On the other hand, from 9-10 on, these deferrals have been deferrals adopted in the beginning of the year. The state knew from the beginning that it couldn't afford the program it wanted to provide, but still chose to implement the deferral as part of the initial budget act. The governor's proposal it continues the sort of increased reliance on deferrals, so that in 9-10 there was a 1.8 deferral, in 9-10 another 1.8, and then in 2011-12 you get to 2.2 in additional deferrals. On page 10, we show you the effect on school district payments and how that's, and this is, school district and community college payments, so you can see what has been the effect from a district in terms of receiving funds. So you can see from February through June, you see all these, there's the fill in the black, that's what school districts still actually receive. The white or empty spots are what they would have received if there had been no deferrals. And so you can see that from February through June, there are about almost 2/3 of their payments that they would normally receive from the state are being now delayed and would be paid in the next fiscal year. And these are all based on the governor's proposals. In how districts deal with it, they are faced with the cash burden of having to have the money on hand to operate their program while they're waiting for the state to pay. So that means for districts, some districts will go in and use their own reserves. They might have enough reserves to pay for this program. Others can borrow from their county office or from a county treasurer, but oftentimes they go to the market and borrow from the private investors through typically what's called a TRAN. It's essentially short-term borrowing to enable school districts to operate the program that they would like to operate. The first deferrals, important to point out too, were June to July deferrals, and they really were like a 2-week waiting period. So the state used to give out the money late June, and then instead they started paying it early July. At this point, you're talking about multiple, up to 5 months, 6 months that school districts are waiting for their payments.
And just one caveat here, I think when finance, for example, was explaining the deferral on the 1.7 and the 2.2, these are new deferrals. You do a deferral, you get 1 year of solution that allows you to keep a higher level of program for 1 year. But if you want to keep a higher level of program the next year and you don't have the dollars, you need to find new money, do a new deferral. So what that means, for example, on page 10, you have to essentially go and take money earlier and earlier in the year for school districts, such that the governor's new 2.1 took a lot of, actually June and May, essentially, although this shows a little payment still being made, it's just a very small cushion. The result was to take essentially the rest of available April payments and a good chunk of March payments. The state had already taken February payments. So every time you do a new deferral, it's going back and taking essentially even more of the K-12 program and paying it even later.
So on the next page, on page 11, we have just some trade-offs in terms of the costs and benefits of doing a deferral. Obviously, the big advantage from doing a deferral is that you reduce the need for districts to make reductions to their program. So school districts are able to operate the same level of program even though the state is providing less in that year. And they have to rely on other sources of revenue temporarily. They have to borrow to make it happen, but they can do that. And based on the information that we're seeing, particularly because the ARA funding expires in the 10-11 year, we think 11-12 could be the most difficult for school districts. So you could say you might want to find ways to make it a little bit easier for school districts to deal with the loss of that funding. That being said, there are some big disadvantages. The first big being obviously that the state is essentially authorizing a level of program for districts to operate that the state can't afford to pay. And the state, this has happened at this point where we're getting to such a high level that we do become a little bit concerned about the district's ability to front the cash to be able to operate these programs. We also think that they are often placed in positions of having to ideally, you wouldn't want districts to, for example, borrow and issue a trans and then have to issue another one to pay off the first trans. But what we've heard is that is often what's occurring. Districts are put in a lot of pressure, particularly now because we have these cross-year trends that we've talked about, and then the state is also in July deferring some of the payments that they're supposed to receive. Essentially, what ends up happening is payments that the state defers payments to July, and then in July they defer the deferred payments for a little bit longer. And so that puts districts in very difficult positions. And so part of the concern, I think right now, school districts have been able to do this because they've been able to find resources. They've been able to find either through their reserves, through their special funds, or from a private lender, someone who will let them borrow the money at relatively cheap rates. We're concerned about, for example, if interest rates rise, how difficult will it be for that to happen? Or, what happens if there are problems in the market in making that happen? On the next page, on page 12, we just show you some of the potential effects from whether you borrowed or, for example, chose not to borrow and instead implement a cut. So in the first case, in the first checkbox, we talked about if the state were to adopt the governor's proposal, which would defer another $2.2 billion in payments. In terms of K-12, what we're looking at is a 6.4% reduction from 2007-8. That's about $530 per pupil. Now, that reduction, including that reduction, you'd also be paying 21% of K-12 program late. Another option would be not to borrow, to just implement a cut. And in that case, districts would be facing an 11% reduction from the 2007-8 level. So that would be about $875 per pupil reduction. And in that case, there's a typo on that bullet there. It should be 16% of K-12 program that would be paid late. So you're creating a larger year-to-year reduction, or a larger reduction for school districts, but you're not paying as much of the program late, and so that's essentially the trade-off. One thing that makes it that perhaps districts might not need to receive this such a big deferral is that what we do know is school district budgeted for 2010-11. They budgeted based on the governor's May revision, which did not include any deferrals. Actually included about a $300 per pupil reduction. That was the governor's May revision proposal for 10-11. That's what they built their budgets. When this 1011 Budget Act was adopted in October, instead of a reduction, it included a payment deferral. So we think that most school districts did not plan to have that available, and they may have downsized their program already, and it might be easier for them. There might be less pain moving forward in dealing with a reduction. However, they did already take some of that pain in adopting their 1011 budgets.
So we spent a lot of time on deferrals. It's your one big K-12 item. We thought we would just very quickly cover two other items. And I think that there are some hearings that might be in the works on these two issues. So again, we'll cover them very quickly today, knowing that there'll be further conversation later. But they are connected to Prop 98. So again, we wanted you to have one place where you could keep track of all of the moving pieces connected to big picture Prop 98 items. One is redevelopment, and then the last is realignment. So just very quickly on redevelopment, you've been hearing about this proposal, and there's about $5 billion in local property tax money that's currently connected to RDAs. And currently, RDAs pass through $1.2 billion of that roughly to local governments. And so schools get a piece of that. They get about $300 million. Currently, then, school districts count a little bit of that to offset their revenue limit payments, and that essentially translates into state savings, about $40 million of that. The rest of it is retained at the local level, typically put in a cap outlay account and used for various school building projects. What the governor is proposing then, in taking this $5 billion and over time eliminating the RDAs and giving the money to the successor agencies, and 11-12 wouldn't have theoretically any impact. It's not intended to have any impact on school districts in 11-12. As some of you have heard, of that $5 billion, $2 billion is designated for retiring debt associated with existing RDA investments. Another $1.7 billion is used as state relief to pay Medi-Cal bills as well as to fund the trial courts. And then the assumption is there'd still be roughly $1.2 billion to pass through to local governments so that schools would get its existing share. Our only concern with this high level is that if the state gets the assumption wrong with the amount required for debt service, maybe it's $3 billion rather than $2 billion, then you don't have enough left over to do the pass-through. So even though the governor has described it as not intending to have any impact on schools in 11-12, there's some likelihood that school districts would. Much more importantly, in 12-13, the idea is that more of this money would begin to flow directly to school districts. The 1.7 would no longer be used for Medi-Cal or the trial courts. It would become lumped together in everything that wasn't needed for debt service, and schools would get a relatively large share of what was available, so about $1 billion. Now, it's unclear, and the administration might be able to tell us more today regarding how that money would get allocated to school districts. There have been a variety of options explored.
He's shaking his head. No.
So at this point, it's been described in various ways. Under one option, the county would keep it, and then it would be distributed within the county on an ADA basis. At other times, it's been described, well, the state would somehow get the money at the state level, provide the money on top of Prop 98, and so it could be evenly distributed. But there are a variety of basic issues. Do you want to give school districts more local property tax money? And if so, why? Do you want them to do something specific with the money? How do you want to distribute it? And if you try to keep it as is normally done at the local level, then because RDAs, the benefits they provide statewide are very disparate, you could end up with some places giving really high increases in per pupil funding and some untouched. And then you have the state authorizing what will appear to be discrepancies in student funding, which isn't entirely consistent with Serrano, a lawsuit that was trying to get these per pupil rates relatively tightly bound. So lots of basic issues to think about. And then turning to realignment, again, completely separate. This deals with the VLF and the sales tax and the $6 billion that would be given to counties, and certain programs would be devolved. There are two that touch upon K-12 issues. One is the criminal justice realignment that would devolve DJJ services to the county over a 3-year period. Because DJJ, the educational component, is funded with Proposition $98, there would be some savings achieved as that devolution occurred. And then with mental health, there's also the proposal that these AB 3632 mental health services, the counties already run them. The counties would continue to under the governor's plan, but you would use realignment dollars as opposed to state dollars to fund the activities. So in these areas, you also have questions about implementation, about funding, if funding is sufficient to cover the required activities. So lots of implementation and conceptual issues to work out over the coming weeks.
Thank you very much. Comment or questions from members? Lots of things to think about. Mr. Bell, you were shaking your head as Ms. Kuhn was describing some of the things that we all need to consider regarding redevelopment and where the monies were going to, and how it's going to be distributed to local schools, or whether or not it was your intent to do that, et cetera. Do you have any?
Oh, just briefly, Madam Chair, and thank you very much. And yes, indeed, the impact for year one, exactly as described. On year two, the intent of the administration is indeed that the funding would go back to whichever entity had originally had those tax revenues, be it cities, counties, schools. Our estimates, again, had been around $1 billion going back to schools, that they'd go back on an ongoing basis. They're intended to supplement the funding that's already provided to schools, but that we're still currently working on a distribution methodology. And so if you saw my reaction, is that we don't have any additional information to share with you at this time on that. That is still underway, and those conversations are still in progress.
When you say funding go back to original source,
yes,
are you talking about going back to 1978? How far back are we going?
Going back to when the RDAs were
when
created.
The redevelopment agencies were created?
Yes.
Okay.
So whenever that tax increment was originally taken. So
okay.
That is the intent.
Okay. LAO, the deferrals, what is it, 21%? Is there any kind of history as to where the cutoff line ought to be, or where we've reached the point of jumping off the cliff, or what's going on?
Well, we haven't really. This is the largest the state has ever had in terms of deferrals. So really, it's not clear if there is a limit and what that limit will be. I think what our cash management folks often tell us in the office is that you can borrow until you can't borrow, and you don't really know exactly when that will be until you get there. So it is difficult to know exactly what that limit would be. It really is about whether school districts can go out and borrow funds if they need to, and so it really just depends on that. The other issue is also that I didn't bring up is that the effects of the deferral really vary significantly across the state, depending on how much a school district relies on general fund revenues versus property taxes. So those districts that receive all of their funding from property taxes, or virtually all from property taxes, the deferral doesn't matter too much to them, and it doesn't change the way they operate very much. But those that rely a lot on general fund, this is a bigger issue, and at some point you would think that those districts, a deferral becomes just a cut because they can't go out and borrow.
Right.
But we're not sure exactly where that limit is. We do know that we did conduct a survey of some school districts over the fall, and the districts did seem to indicate that if there was another deferral, almost half thought that at least one of the things they would do would be to consider making reductions, not just going out and borrowing, but also considering making cuts.
I have a follow-up question.
So just in another, to build upon Edgar's response, you haven't hit the limit yet. And dispensing with a lot of technical jargon on borrowing and all of it, you seem to be getting close. So you might be able to do one, you might be able to even do a larger one, but you will be impacting districts disparately already with the existing revenue limits before the 1.7, before the 2.1. About 20% of districts, like Edgar said, are already not being able to find the cash and cutting instead as one of the things they're doing. When we just said, okay, say we add a new one, and we didn't even specify the magnitude. 40% of districts more said that they would cut. So as you do more and more deferrals, more will be cutting, less will be able to access cash, and the borrowing tools will become less useful for them. And the risks for defaulting are huge.
Right.
CSBA says one of their districts has defaulted and never been able to participate again. So the stakes are very high, and the state is getting close, just even on paper, for making it workable.
Well, we do have we have a growing list of school districts that are not able to do their own budgets anymore, right? I mean, there's the growing list of negative budgets.
Yeah, we're at about 15 that are negative.
And a growing list of those who might become negative the next year.
Right, and if you're negative, you typically can't do short-term borrowing. The market just doesn't trust you enough to participate with you, engage in that process. And then there are hundreds, some that are at risk. And sometimes they'll be able to access cash. The market will think they're in good enough shape, and sometimes they'll walk away. And so now you have 1 in 10 districts in this vulnerable position where just because their budget's in pretty bad shape, they might not be able to borrow. For them, it's a cut as well. For small districts, it's very likely a cut because they don't participate in using all these external instruments anyhow. Even some of the large ones have just drained their reserves. They've gone to the market. They've tried to upsize. Now the market's wary. There's a special session. There's lots of things.
Okay. Senator Huff and then Senator Wright.
Yeah, for LAO or finance. I understand districts can get a hardship waiver from the deferral process. Can you help us understand what the process is for getting a hardship waiver?
Yeah, so this was a hardship waiver that was just put into in 1011, and what it says is districts can get a waiver from the June to July deferral, so not the entire deferral, but the June to July piece, and they have to submit some information to the Department of Finance that shows that they potentially could go insolvent if they don't receive that funding.
But it's just that 1 month shift.
The way it's designed to work is as a result of any of the deferrals, whether they were a February deferral, an April deferral, etc., doesn't matter what's causing the problem. If a district gets to June and it can't make payroll, then it can submit an application to say, give me what I need to make June payroll. So the state wrote the language very strictly because it didn't want a huge cost. It wanted to save those just who wouldn't technically survive unless they got money in June.
Chris Ferguson, Department of Finance. I would also note that within that extreme hardship provision that every school district or charter school that has applied for a deferral exemption has been granted one.
How many?
In the current year, it's approximately 175 local educational agencies, but that is only, I believe, 2 school districts, and the remainder were charter schools.
2 unified school districts?
That is correct.
And the rest were charters?
Correct.
Okay, Senator Wright?
The concern I have, I guess, in the RDA discussion, I mean, you answered the other thing. I mean, effectively, we're kiting checks here when we do the deferral. So that question I got. I mean, in my neighborhood, people go to jail for kiting checks, but I guess we'll do it differently when it's government. But in the RDA, I mean, typically they take all the property tax. So again, when I was talking to someone earlier, you could make an argument that if Inglewood forms an RDA, that it perhaps would be unfair to ask a lady in Stockton to pay for it if the state has to backfill the property tax money that went to the RDA. I mean, if you start from the premise that the first dollar that goes into the local school's cup is the local property tax money, if you take that out because you form an RDA, then the state's obligated to backfill what the RDA took out, which would require then that lady in Stockton pay for the Inglewood RDA. I mean, it's not just her, but it's the whole state, but I just used her as an example. If you decided that you weren't going to have an RDA, then that would affect, certainly in a prospective basis, that you wouldn't get to have any. But all of the RDAs that have their money encumbered, you couldn't affect that anyway. I mean, they've got contracts, and so I don't know how you go about budgeting money that ain't available. I mean, some of them have begun to see increased revenue because the development produces more revenue. But it would seem that that would go back to the pot on a pro rata basis the way that it did before. The school got so much, the county got so much, the special district. I mean, however it was allocated in that region, some areas or basic aid, they don't even take general fund money. So for them, this would all be irrelevant because they don't care anyway. I mean, but I'm trying to understand how the state considers that it would have impact or any say in money that it heretofore didn't have any say-so in.
And Senator, I'm sorry, I'm not a part of those discussions, but I'll be happy to take that question back to the staff that is a part of those conversations and make sure that.
I'm saying if you I mean, it would seem to me that if we said if the city of Sacramento forms an RDA to build a basketball stadium. Okay, so they took a piece of land and diverted the property tax from that on an increment to the RDA. Mm-hmm. Okay, that now means that somebody is on the hook to pay that tax money into the Sacramento School District. So everybody else in the state, in effect, by general fund application, would be sending their dollar to cover a decision made by the city of Sacramento. Right? Would that
just from a school district perspective, and just focusing on how it would otherwise work, actually not the administration, because the state has done this before. It's not completely unprecedented to do, not at all, to do things with local property tax monies. Recognizing that communities, when it comes to property wealth, are all over the map when it comes across California. But essentially what's being done is taking about $5 billion in local property tax money and set aside all the existing debt obligations and assuming that everybody honors those agreements. But just taking, say folks believe that RDAs weren't the best policy and they want to do something differently. There's going to be some transitional issues, but over time they want to be phasing them out and taking the money. It would be treated like local property tax money, and the money would flow to school districts in the area. But the state then would say, well, how much money have we set on a per-pupil basis for those? And now that they have a little bit more local property tax money, we'll give them a little less state money to ensure that everybody's still getting generally what the state thought. So again, the state it has done redistribution with its state general fund dollars for decades, right, but it still keeps the local property tax dollars at the state level. This is the notion of whether you really do want them to offset Proposition 98 costs and keep the student rates relatively similar.
Well, we did, and I'm old enough to remember, but yeah, AB 8, I guess it was, that came up with that formula for how you do that. That's clear. So I'm saying that first dollar that goes into a school district is local property tax money. And pre-ERAF, we kind of sort of left property tax alone, and we did ERAF because we lost a lawsuit that said that there was disparate funding that circled. I'm saying I think that you're trying to spend other people's money here. I don't know that you can come in and say, for example, the first year the discussion is that it would go to fund the trial courts and Medi-Cal. I'm not even sure that that's legal. I'm not a lawyer, but that doesn't appear to be legal. And then in the subsequent times, I could see where those monies that were not encumbered, that an RDA was holding, you could move that back, and I would imagine that it should move back at the same formula that it would have moved at had there not been an RDA in the first place. And that would then offset, such as it is, if there were no additional RDAs formed, then there wouldn't be any additional backfill responsibilities, and there would not be any going forward because you would have eliminated them. I think that's not the more prudent policy. The policy might be that you don't want to create a situation where the city of Sacramento, because it wants a basketball arena, can create a situation where the city of Los Angeles helps pay for it through increase in the tax. I get that part, and I think you can make an argument that the pass-through element that is now done by RDAs on a voluntary basis should just become the standard. That if the city of Sacramento wants a basketball stadium and the city and county are prepared to pay for it under whatever arrangements that they make, that ought not be the state's business. Our only interest would be whether or not the city of Sacramento made a decision that caused the state to backfill to cover the cost. Outside of that, I don't think it's our business, and I think it would violate two other propositions to try to make it something that we would take. But I think you could make a sound argument as to if an RDA is formed, or if an RDA is in place, or if an RDA wants to go out, that they have to hold harmless the school district that was going to be affected by the formation of the RDA. I would think that that would be the state's only financial interest in that context.
That leads me to a question here for the LAO. I mean, what are your greatest concerns about the governor's RDA proposals as it does affect Prop 98 in K-12 education?
Well, I think there are two issues to keep in mind, and it really depends on exactly how the details end up looking for the proposal. In one scenario that we heard talked about was the use of the additional RDA funding that previously was the RDA had that now would go to school districts, that would be funding on top of Proposition 98. Now, we're not sure exactly what you can do to make it not count as Proposition 98, because Proposition 98 says it's state and local proceeds of taxes. But the other issue is that if you did do that, you have to distribute the funding within counties, and that creates some inequities, because it's really the districts all the districts who are in counties that had a lot of redevelopment would get a lot of money under that scenario, and those who are in counties who don't have any redevelopment don't get any money. So you have these inequities that would occur, and particularly since the state in the 70s was sued partly because of differences in funding based on the wealth of the assessed value of school districts. Right. That's a concern. In the other scenario where the funding is not linked to local property taxes and would come from the general fund, we don't see how that could be done without it counting as Prop 98. And that was our understanding, that was part of the idea that this funding would go on top of Prop 98, and we just don't see how that's possible.
And realignment is much more thorny, and I know lots of smart people are trying to figure out how to make it work. But it's much easier on redevelopment to get it to work if people want it to work. Because as Edgar described, you can do what you normally do with local property tax monies. You can just say, we don't want to do RDAs anymore, and we want that money to flow back to school districts, and we want to count it to Prop 98, and we'll do the things we normally do when local property tax dollars are shifted, and we'll use the state dollars, the second dollar, to even things out. And so at least in this case, if you wanted it to work, it's not a huge technical issue to get it to be effective.
Okay, and that's where finance's position is. It's not a big deal. You can make it work. Redevelopment.
And we're still working on that proposal.
Because again, the way they've described it, they have they have issues almost everywhere they turn. So it's only if you use this very sort of historically used approach where you can overcome those obstacles.
Okay. We believe that the proposal is possible, and we are indeed working on it right now, but I don't have any more details to share with you today in the subcommittee.
Sure. Okay. Senator Huff, we happy?
No, but that's a different issue.
Okay, that's right. All right, I think we've covered this conversation adequately, and let's get the Department of Education up here to respond to what you have heard from both the Department of Finance and the LAO's office.
Madam Chair, if I may, I'd just like to clarify that the growth rate is 0.22%, not 2.2%.
Yeah. That's in the printed. Good afternoon. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. My name is Erin Gable. I'm the Legislative Director for State Superintendent Tom Torlakson, and I'm here with Scott Hannon. And the State Superintendent is planning to join you on February 1st to provide his overview on the state of education funding in the budget, so I will keep my remarks brief and on point with today's agenda. The state superintendent appreciates that the governor's budget acknowledges that schools have experienced a disproportionate amount of the real budget cuts over the last 3 years, and that it upholds the Prop 98 minimum guarantee for funding for our schools, and finally that it seeks to limit further state budget cuts in this upcoming fiscal year. He's particularly pleased to see that the governor's budget proposes an extension of the temporary revenues in order to further prevent more cuts to our state school budgets this year, and that it extends categorical flexibility for the next 2 years to allow school districts to plan for their local budgets. However, the state superintendent would like to underscore for the legislature that this budget does not protect our students from all cuts in the coming budget year. In the budget year, schools are losing $5.8 billion in Federal Recovery Act dollars that they have to date used to postpone deep cuts and layoffs in local schools. Furthermore, the proposed budget makes deep cuts in child care. And each cut to child care is a cut that affects at least 2 lives, that of the child and that of the parent. So it is important to look at how to uphold high-quality child care here in California so that we can get our kids ready for school and get our parents ready for work. Finally, the new cash deferral of $2 billion exacerbates cash flow issues affecting districts and adds to budgeting uncertainty at the local level. This year's budget may not reflect a major year-over-year reduction in Prop 98, but 17% of the total is a deferral of previous year funding. Of the total funding in the budget year, 21%, as the LAO mentioned, will actually be paid in 2012-2013. And outside of education, the budget also has major... I'm sorry, ma'am?
No, you said be paid back in 2012-13. I just said maybe.
Getting to another point that I'll make, absolutely. Outside of education, the budget contains deep cuts to higher education programs and other programs affecting students and their families, like Medi-Cal and CalWorks. In terms of redevelopment in the RDA proposal, the governor's proposal proposes to redirect the property taxes now going to redevelopment agencies. In the out years, this proposal may provide additional funds for schools above the Prop 98 funds they currently receive. However, we want to add that in the 2011-2012 budget year, there may be schools who will lose RDA funds that they're currently using for facilities. We don't have all the details on the RDA proposal yet, and may have more comments as those details emerge. In terms of realignment, there are realignment proposals that directly touch education that we will be discussing in further hearings. That one is the child care programs, which I know is proposed for Phase 2, and there have been few details on, but we wanted to raise that issue, as well as mental health services for children receiving special education services, a la AB 3632. And then the Division of Juvenile Justice shift to the counties. I wanted to point out today that the DJJ proposal will have an impact on the county offices of education who are providing education services to these youths. If the realignment does include the DJJ proposal, the superintendent recommends that the legislature consider the difficulty of meeting the extreme needs in educating these youth and address the inadequacy in funding at the county level for these programs. As I mentioned before, changes to non-education services like CalWorks and Medi-Cal impact students and their families. These services affect the abilities of students to show up at school and to learn. And there are many best practices throughout the state of California on using schools as a delivery system for Health and Human Services as a school community center, and the superintendent would recommend the legislature consider schools at the table when they're looking at realignment service delivery systems. Also, to the extent that realignment plans to divert money that would otherwise be deposited in the general fund, realignment may result in lower Prop 98 funding levels. The California Department of Education will be monitoring the realignment process as it works its way through the legislative process and can provide further comment as details develop. So on to deferrals. With the new $2.1 billion K-12 deferral proposed in the budget, schools would receive $9.4 billion, or 21% of their 2011-2012 funds in the 2012-13 budget year. This $9.4 billion is equivalent to 43% of their state aid for revenue limits or general purpose funds. I've passed out a little graphic that our folks have put together to provide a visual aid on just what a dramatic piece of their year-to-year funding this represents. Schools have had to deal with major cash flow challenges in the past few years, both between years and within years, as the LAO's graphic so wonderfully shows. And as the state has shifted more and more of its budget and cash flow issues to the local level through these deferrals. In addition to cash flow challenges, these shifts have real costs. Districts incur interest costs when the state does not pay its bills on time and can get into financial trouble if they cannot get their loans or if the interest costs are too high because of the fragile situation of their budget at a local level. Further, the deferrals may cause uncertainty at the local level where the commitment of the state to make good on paying those deferrals may be called into question, to your comment. CDE is working with the Department of Finance on the technical details of the proposed deferrals and hardship waivers in cases where the deferrals may cause a school district to go into insolvency. And Scott is here to answer any questions you guys may have pursuant to that afterwards.
Okay.
Sorry, just
no, go
one
ahead.
last little quick thing. To date, regarding the financial status and the hardship waivers, and our information is maybe a little bit different from the Department of Finance's. The department has received the 2010-11 first interim certifications for approximately 749 of the state's 1,023 school districts and county offices.
How many?
For 749 of them so far. Of these 749, 93, or 12%, are certified as either qualified or negative in status. Specifically, 13 are certified negative, meaning that these local education agencies will be unable to meet their financial obligations in the current year or in the next year. And 80 are certified as qualified, meaning that these local education agencies may not be able to meet their financial obligations in the current year or the next coming 2 years. We will have more complete information this spring, and we'll share that information with the legislature. The deadline for submitting that information to CDE has passed, but we are waiting for a number of counties that we permitted to have extra time. So, okay. Deferral waivers are available if an LEA faces extreme hardship as a result of the deferral. Last June, we received applications from 8 school districts and 52 charter schools for exemption from the planned deferrals of $2.5 billion in each of the July, October, and March deferrals. In addition, 2 school districts and 79 charter schools submitted applications for the second deferral exemption for the 2.5 deferral in March of 2011. In total, 10 school districts and 131 charter schools have applied for the exemption for the March 2011 deferral at an estimated cost of approximately $60 million. All of the applications have been approved, and we wanted to note that there's been no exemption process for the inter-year deferrals in February, April, and May. Beginning in 2010-2011, the Department of Finance may exempt LEAs from the June deferral up to a statewide total of $300 million, provided that the $300 million doesn't set us over the cap of Prop 98 limits. Applications are due in April of 2011. However, there's no, as I mentioned earlier, there's no relief from the cross-year deferrals in February, April, and May. So we urge the legislature to explore an exemption for this process as well, as far as we can within the $300 million ceiling. So in conclusion, on behalf of State Superintendent Tom Torlakson, we look forward to working with the legislature and the governor on finding ways to identify more revenues to support our local schools, to protect California's students from further budget cuts, and to make sure that the creative budget solutions and the realignment proposals don't have any unintended consequences on our students. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay. Thank you very much. I think that concludes our testimony, and if we don't have any questions, let's allow the public to come and express their concerns with the governor's budget proposals. You don't have to answer, right? You can go. Unless you want to answer. Why don't you come and identify yourself quickly, and you have to press the button.
Okay.
With a red light, it goes on.
I'm Pat Ryan. I represent the California Mental Health Directors Association. I wanted to talk briefly about the proposed realignment of AB 3632, the Mental Health Special Education Program. I know you're going to have.
About that today.
You are going to hear that next week, and we'll go into more detail then. But I guess all I'll say today to limit my testimony is that we agree with the LIO's analysis, our preliminary analysis of the governor's proposed budget, which is that this may be a candidate for realignment, but it would be more appropriate to realign it to schools rather than to counties, since it's a special education federal entitlement program. And I don't need to go into all of the funding problems that we've had with this state mandate on counties, but just to say that the state currently owes counties over $500 million for this state mandate, and there are many policy and fiscal problems associated with this mandate that I think we need to take the time to fully explore before we realign it and some of its dysfunction to counties permanently. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, members. I'm Liz Guillen with Public Advocates. As you know, we partner very closely with community-based organizations statewide representing over 500,000 parents and students, and that partnership informs our work. And it helps us translate the reality that they face, especially faced by poor students, students of color, and immigrant students. We're very concerned about the deferrals. As was stated earlier, deferrals in their schools really translates to real cuts. Whether Prop 98 recovers in future years is never clear to me under various explanations, some conflicting. But the harm done to these students cannot be recovered or remediated. There's no exemption for them in passing the exit exam. There's no exemption in getting enough high school graduation credits or obtaining the credits in A to G in order for them to be eligible for admission to university. We feel that the state has underfunded schools for years relative to what is needed to get all kids the 21st century education we tout. And it's the basis for the lawsuit in which we represent 5 grassroots organizations across the state. And what we seek from the court is that the current system of funding is unconstitutional, and we want an order from the court to ask the legislature to fix it. Unlike the Robles-Wong lawsuit, our lawsuit called the Campaign for Quality Education versus the State seeks foundational reforms to ensure that school funding is effectively spent and that it includes an adequate data system to ensure that the dollars are spent on programs and policies that provide the greatest access to a meaningful education, an adequate system for ensuring the most important element in student learning, well-prepared, effective teachers are available to all students, particularly those in the neediest schools, and preschool for all students. Even though the court has ruled against us, we believe that was because the court had a very narrow reading of the Constitution to limit the education and equal protection clauses of the Constitution. We feel that is a very temporary setback and a very long struggle. For example, the Superior Court in Serrano also dismissed the case entirely, initially, only later to be corrected by appellate review. Because of this, we're very concerned, too, about the proposal to increase funding to charter schools. We feel like there should be more focus on the public schools that serve the most students, and especially when charter schools are not held to the same level of accountability as other public schools. So I would mention that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Senator Huff, staff. First of all, I want to thank you for holding this hearing today. We know that you're on an abbreviated budget calendar this year. We want to be as helpful as we can be. Again, Pamela Gibbs for the Los Angeles County Office of Education. I'm here to speak to the realignment issue for the DJJ wards that remain at the DJJ facilities who will be coming to the juvenile court schools. We're not sure what the proposal is exactly because I know that's still being worked out. Our concern remains the same as last year, that any savings in Prop 98 funds be shifted along with the wards to the juvenile court schools. Currently, DJJ receives approximately $30 million per ward. As of December 31st, 2010, they have 1,262 wards. So that amounts to about $23,000 per youth. For the youth who are attending juvenile court schools, they receive about $8,000 to $9,000 per award. We want to be able to provide the best services to these kids. We want to reduce the prison going rate and improve the college going rate. I know that many of you have visited our sites. We urge you to come again. We've made vast improvements as audits have occurred, issues have been raised, and we're trying to address those at the same time while experiencing cuts. So we appreciate your support last year. We know this issue is ongoing. This seems to be perhaps the final realignment of the remaining kids there, and however that moves forward, we'll see in the details as they come forward. We look forward to working with you, and we ask for your support on this issue. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Wow. Let's get back a little bit. Margaret Johnson with Disability Rights California. We're here just to mention our concerns about AB 3632 and the realignment from the Mental Health Services Act. Our main mission is to ensure that children get the services that they need, and our concern is that the services continue in place for kids with disabilities in the school system. And our concern with some of the questions here about shifting the funding to school districts to handle it is that there's not really a transition plan in place or any information put in place that would make that happen so that kids would be served. As you probably know, the past governor attempted to do that, and there was quite a bit of chaos when he suspended the mandate. So we'd want to just ensure that kids are served and that they're not left out in the cold. We'd also encourage you to look at getting a Medicaid waiver to serve some kids through that have emotional disabilities, psychiatric disabilities. There are some waivers. We prepared a letter that I submitted kind of late, but that includes links to places where you can find more out about that and see what other states have done in that regard. So that might be a way to serve kids that currently aren't being served under Medicaid. They're kids you'd have to serve anyway, and you would get some Medicaid dollars to help supplement what's being spent on those kids already. Our other concern is about shifting the Mental Health Services Act funds. We're not really sure how that's going to happen or where those funds are going to come from. Our concern would be that if programs are closed, it might lead to people being either homeless, incarcerated, or otherwise institutionalized, and that may, as you know, violate the integration mandate of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We don't know yet if that's the case because it's not really clear where that money is going to be shifted from. So those are essentially our concerns and our recommendations to look into getting some additional funds brought in through a Medicaid waiver. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
My name's Steve Rhodes. I'm here representing San Bernardino, City Unified, and Santa Ana. First, we appreciate all the emphasis placed on deferrals. I think the recent report that came out today from the LAO is very, very good. And we will be looking into this issue. I'm here, though, to talk about one or 2 points, and that is the first in the handout. The first page is from the governor's talking points that he did to the press on the budget, and the point I want to make about this handout is it shows that education has taken some real cuts. This is total Prop 98, includes also community colleges and also the child development. And the 49.3 is a level that we appreciate, but it's a cut of about $7.3 billion from 2007-8 and about 13%. And you can just see over time we have taken cuts and over $1,000 a child. The second attachment is some talking points that I did for school districts. Some of them are a little bombastic, so please excuse that.
It's not your style, Steve.
It's not my style. But the purpose of this was to show, and it's embedded in this chart, or one of the purposes was that we've taken more cuts than what we think other state programs have. In that chart that I had before from the governor's office, I think other state programs actually have a slight increase from 7 to 8. Not very much, but a slight increase. And the percentage change in this year from last year, and even in the governor's proposal, we think other state programs will have a higher increase. And we're supportive of the governor's budget. Our concern is that we don't want everybody to feel that we're getting tons of money at the expense of other people. We think it's the other way around, and just want to make that point. On redevelopment, I should probably say a word. I did testify on the Serrano issue, and there are Serrano issues. We're very concerned about the second-year funding. It's very, very important to education. I don't know if the funding, if you do it to the school district, which would be our preference to school districts I represent. It's a little bit akin to basic aid districts. When you have excess property tax, you give it to those school districts as opposed to giving it statewide. So I think those issues are going to be interesting to take a look at, and we're very, very supportive of what the governor is trying to do, and especially the part about making an excess of Prop 98 and giving it to the school districts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, Bill Lucia with Ed Voice. Like Steve, I think I want to just talk, at a high level go over some maybe off of both this chart here and the Legislative Analyst Office handouts. At a very high level, it hasn't been brought up yet, but their handout, I think, mentioned, I think there was a new terminology here of disassociation with Prop 98 in terms of what general proceeds of revenue, state and local, look like. We would say that based on current law, this budget represents actually a reduction of $2 billion, because in just taking the $6 billion off the table and saying, well, that's part of realignment, is inconsistent with how this committee or the legislature has dealt with keeping tabs and columns of what's a baseline budget and the resources that are actually available to schools under current law versus what's being proposed. So just to point that out, as well as in terms of the deferrals, this chart is what schools are faced with this year right now. So this does not include the additional $2+ billion that's being proposed for K-14. One way of looking at this from the school's perspective is just to fold it right here on the right-hand margin where it says end of fiscal year, and look at the green, which is what used to happen, and then now look at the red, and that's what schools are getting. These are all charts and graphs and tables and numbers, and you just had that testimony. But to put it in layman's terms, what the budget is proposing is the equivalent of shutting down Los Angeles Unified for an entire year and taking that money and giving it to the rest of the state budget. So, and that's what the school, the proposal is before you, to take the school accounts and hold back the cash to fund all of the operating budget of Los Angeles Unified for a year, and then to add insult to injury in the school accounts is to ask the schools to pay the interest on that and absorb that within their own budgets in a subsequent fiscal year, and for however long the borrowing takes, in order to get those deferrals paid in the subsequent fiscal year. We would encourage you, if you go down the route of deferrals, and if deferrals are here to stay at some form or level, to be truth in advertising vis-a-vis education accounts in the non-education side of the budget, and create some degree of fairness. If education accounts are providing the rest of the state budget a $10 billion cash loan, then maybe it would be appropriate for the rest of the budget to absorb some of those borrowing costs, origination fees, and other things. But as the LAO pointed out, an increasing number of schools, unified districts, rural schools, urban schools, are going to be faced with challenges. And on the margin, when those origination fees and interest costs are paid, those monies are gone. And what that means to a school district like Stockton, just south of here, we heard from their CFO on Friday. They typically ran trans about once every 7 years. Now they're doing it twice a year, and it's costing them $300,000 to $400,000. That's an enrollment. To give you a size of magnitude, their enrollment is roughly 35,000 kids. One more comment at the high level on the redevelopment agency issue. We encourage you that the details, to be very clear in this subcommittee, to go through the details and be aware that the details matter. You've heard about the Serrano potential issues. We look at this proposal, not quite clear yet where finance is landing, but the possibility of creating additional classes of excess revenue limit districts that may create a perception of a relative position of benefit, which may or may not actually be the case. You may have some cases like in Compton where they get less than $800 per pupil in property tax revenue, and they may, the schools in Compton, benefit to some degree on the margin, having that money transfer back to the school district from an RDA. But depending on actually how that's held, in both looking at revenue limit bands, Serrano, and to whether or not the state of California is going to offset those dollars to school districts are actually counted in excess, is going to create really a whole nother need to layer over review in terms of Serrano fairness and equity, and looking at low property wealth, rural areas, even in urban areas, and look at what's happening in those communities relative to other parts of the state where they may already be at the basic aid level or marginally almost at basic aid, where the RDA transfer would, in terms of Serrano bands, actually put them way outside of the state's public policy goals.
Thank you. Thank you. Lots to consider.
My name is Rusty Selix with the California Council of Community Mental Health Agencies, not normally before this subcommittee. I prepared a paper as to how we represent the nonprofit agencies that contract with counties primarily, and also some school districts, to serve the children in special education that need mental health services. And to react to the proposal, our basic premise is that the policy of the proposal by the governor is a good one. We think that the financial incentives that are created if you do what the counties have asked to do, both in court and in this legislative proposal of turning the program back to schools, takes us back to where we were before we had AB 3632. At that time, California had the 49th rated thing of identifying the children who needed this care. It creates incentives for schools to not find the children that needs this care. That creates enormous adverse results in terms of children getting much sicker, being much higher at risk for dropouts, criminal justice, and all of those things. So we don't want the financial risk to be on the school side. We think that if it's at the state or county side, it works better. And frankly, while obviously the idea of having the state pay for it versus counties pay for it puts mental health at less risk in general, the current funding arrangement with SB 90 claims and all this has been a disaster. And so we think that the structure of this program works well. There is one problem, and it's a very big one, but it's small relative to things, which is that this program has had a growth rate that is likely to exceed the growth rate of the revenues proposed for the transfer. Now, if we can fix that for the Medi-Cal piece, that's part of the realignment that is clearly not part of this subcommittee's jurisdiction, but is part of Sub 3 in terms of health care, we can fix it for this program. So we're optimistic that a solution can be found, but that's the one problem we see, is find a way to deal with the fact that the costs of this program have historically grown faster than state revenues grow. So if we can address that problem, then we think this is a great proposal, because from a policy standpoint, this is the way to fund the program.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hi.
Cecilia Mansfield, representing the California State PTA. First of all, I'd like to say that we certainly understand the magnitude of the budget crisis facing California and the difficult choices that are going to have to be made. But I am here to express our deep concern about the cumulative impact of cuts in child care and development programs. These disproportionately impact a lot of our most vulnerable children and families, especially the CalWORKS Stage 3 program that either can put children in jeopardy or cause people who have been able to work to no longer be able to work, and at a time when we're concerned about jobs and saving jobs and creating jobs in California, it seems like further cuts and the cuts that have taken place so far in this program are ones that need to be carefully considered. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, members, I'm Dennis Myers with the California Association of School Business Officials. We, too, just fully recognize the severity of the situation that you're dealing with and appreciate Governor Brown's proposal to quote-unquote level fund schools, and so we appreciate the effort there. We intend to work very hard to make sure that the continuance of the temporary revenue is successful because we know that while he did not lay out specific things that would happen if that doesn't continue, we know that Prop 98 does drop in that instance, and it would be very difficult for you to continue funding us at the level as proposed. Right. But just a couple things to point out to you. Level funding at Prop 98 in this budget doesn't exactly equate to level funding at the district level because of the interaction of the deficit factor on revenue limits. The way it's calculated by the Department of Finance, districts will have to budget for about a $19 per ADA reduction in addition to just not getting a COLA. So I just wanted to point that out to you as you're looking at the information, just to know that when we talk about level funding, it's level funding with a little asterisk on there. At the same time, there are lots of things kind of hanging out that we don't know when you can pull a budget together or when the revenues, that solution would come together, but we want to urge you to take fast action on several issues. The issue of the deferral. Districts are planning their borrowing right now. They're looking into the future, trying to figure out exactly how to plan their budget, and the deferral is a huge question mark. As you've already heard, it increases our borrowing costs, and even though in today's market borrowing costs are less than they have been in the past, it's still an issue for cash flow that we need to know sooner rather than later. Also, on the issue of flexibility, we appreciate the governor recognizing that with the sunset of all of the various flexibilities that have been adopted in the past, that's a huge cliff that districts are having to plan for. You've already heard that districts are turning in their certifications. Well, when districts do their planning, they have to look at the budget year and a couple of years out, and that's something they've had to try to figure out is how they build the bridge back to all the rules and regulations on those 40 programs, as well as the other levels of flexibility. So we'd encourage you, as you're looking at trying to get stuff done by March, to try to reach the governor's timeline, that flexibility be on that agenda as well, to get that done before the election as opposed to later, and not even tie it to the success or failure of the election. We need that flexibility no matter what happens there. And then lastly, just on the issue of the realignment issues. When it comes to redevelopment, we just ask that you recognize that as you are considering it, and we know Department of Finance hasn't finalized their proposal, but as we talk about local government and trying to protect areas of local government that have encumbered their redevelopment money, school districts have also done so. There's a portion of money that goes to school districts that is used for facilities, and many districts have encumbered that either through COPs or actual construction contracts, and we would ask that you really look at that as far as you're trying to protect some of local government where they've encumbered it, to also look at what school districts have done as well. And then lastly, on how that money gets distributed, we know the governor has proposed in 2012 making that real new money to school districts, and we'd ask that you would find a way to make sure that happens on an equitable basis. And again, we're all anticipating to find out what finance proposes, but from our perspective, there is a way to work real hard to figure out how districts across the state would benefit from that, not just districts that are currently in the redevelopment agency. So this is the beginning. We appreciate you opening this up to the public comment, and we hope to participate with you at each of your hearings. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, members, I'm Sharon Scott Dow, representing the Advancement Project, and the deferral thing is going to be a real issue with school districts remaining solvent. So we want you to take a really good look at that and try to see what would work best for school districts so we don't lose any more teachers. And also we'd like to associate with the California State PTA on the child care and early education issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, Steve Henderson representing the California School Employees Association. We're generally supportive of the governor's approach to the budget. We appreciate the fact that he has recognized that education programs have taken a cut of over $18 billion over the last 3 years, which have resulted in a lot of layoffs at the local level, a lot of staff being deferred, and the elimination of a lot of programs that are there to service students to help them be successful. Having said that, I'd also like to point out, and you only touched on this briefly during this hearing, but my organization in particular, must comment on the $400 million reduction to community colleges. The magnitude of that reduction is going to severely impact community colleges at a point in time when they are trying to service as many folks in the community as possible, being those kids coming from K-12, those folks that have lost their job in the economy and trying to retool their skills. The magnitude of this reduction at this point in time is really, really going to stress community colleges throughout the state and their ability to successfully help students.
Appreciate the comments. Thank you.
I guess last but not least, Estelle Lemieux with the California Teachers Association, and we support the general direction and the proposal, the governor's budget proposal that he's proposed. We think it's the only direction to go at this point by adding revenues. You've heard from many people about how education has borne the brunt of cuts in the last several years. And we're happy that the governor realizes that our students are a very vital asset to this state because they are our future. They are our future workforce. And if we're going to make things change and turn around here, we have to invest in our students because they are California's future. So with that, we look forward to working with the legislature, with the governor, and everyone else to see if we can resolve this and make this happen for our kids. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, thank you. It's been instructional, and we look forward to having you come back. I think our next meeting is the 26th, right? January 26th, next on Wednesday at 2:30 in this room, and we will be talking about the folks who did get cut, the UCs and CSUs. So we'll look forward to having you participate. Thanks. Meeting adjourned.